So it's my delight to introduce Adam Robert, who is an extraordinary scholar. Adam graduated the MA in PCC in 2010, 2011, and then returned 5 years later to begin his PhD. And I have to admit that I have been thoroughly intimidated by Adam's mind and ability to comprehend extremely complex philosophical texts. And I've been striving since the beginning of my time in PCC to be able to keep up with him. So he's a great inspiration. And he has launched an amazing project called The Side View, and it has multiple facets. A podcast, a journal, the second issue just came out. He's carrying copies with him. A number of you have articles in the first and second issue. So his work is just rippling forward, and I honestly want to know how you structure your time, because it's just amazing how much you achieve. So without any further ado, let me pass things over to Adam.
Thanks, Becca, for that introduction. I tried to live up to that image of myself. So I want to talk to you about philosophy in a particular mode. The mode I want to talk to you about is philosophy as spiritual exercise. And this is an image of philosophy that I take from Pierre Hadot, a French historian and very much a philosopher himself. And this image of philosophy as spiritual exercise is something that he says is really at the root of what philosophy should be and has been, both in the ancient world and throughout history. Whenever philosophy has been done well, whenever it has been done right, whenever it is sort of path-breaking or especially deep and insightful, it's come along with not just a set of theoretical statements or propositional arguments or analytical attitudes to the world, but with exercises, spiritual exercises. And he groups these exercises under the word askēsis. So a big part of what I'm going to talk to you about today is just this word, askēsis, and the many ways that we might put it to use. And so when Hadot talks about spiritual exercises, he really means askēsis. And he would go on to borrow this phrase from Henri Bergson to define philosophy as a transformation in perception. And the means by which your perception is transformed is through this activity called askēsis. So there's a relationship here between practice and perception. The one feeds into and out of the other. And so my question is, what is that relation? Can I put some words to it? Can I describe it in a way that you find compelling and you could use as a description for your own practices, your own exercises of transformation? We all have these exercises. We all use them in different ways. We all know they work. That's why we do them. But it might not be extremely clear or obvious on the surface of it why they work or how they work. So my presentation and the dissertation project in general, a lot of the stuff that I'm doing with the side view that Becca mentioned, is really about this question: what is the relationship between our practices and how we perceive the world? So I'm going to go through that question by using some resources from transcendental philosophy. This is Kant's transcendental philosophy, sort of the initiator of the German idealist tradition, and also some phenomenology. And so what I want to say just right at the outset is that if you're familiar with these traditions at all, my belief is that askēsis, or practice, works on what phenomenologists call the intentional structure of perception. And it also, the title is Folding the Manifold, and this word manifold I take from Kant's philosophy, meaning the manifold of intuition, or the manifold of sensibility. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about what that means, but my sense is that practice is about shaping that manifold. It's about folding it and unfolding it, packing it and unpacking it, getting it to move in different ways. So that in some sense, your very experience, your very perception of the world is some kind of a composition. You understand that it has this aesthetic, sensible layer to it, right? But that it's not just that you're participating in constructing it in some sort of distanced and detached way, but that your practices are actually ways where you turn your perception itself into a kind of an art form. And that's your experience of the world. So I want to talk a little bit about philosophy as spiritual exercise, some examples of askēsis. I'll say a little bit about my method, how I approach these questions, and then we'll get into some of these details about Kant and phenomenology. But so I want to start with a quote from Hadot, where he justifies his use of this phrase, spiritual exercise. He says, philosophy is spiritual exercise, but why not something else? Why spiritual exercise? And so he says, the expression spiritual exercises is a bit disconcerting for the contemporary reader. In the first place, it is no longer quite fashionable these days to use the word spiritual. It is nevertheless necessary to use the term, I believe, because none of the other adjectives we could use, psychic, moral, ethical, intellectual, of thought, of the soul, covers all of the aspects of the reality we want to describe. Since in these exercises, it is thought that which, as it were, takes itself as its own subject matter and seeks to modify itself, it would be possible for us to speak in terms of thought exercises. Yet the word thought does not indicate clearly enough that imagination and sensibility play a very important role in these exercises. For the same reason, we cannot be satisfied with intellectual exercises, although such intellectual factors as definition, division, ratiocination, reading, investigation, and rhetorical amplification play a large role in them. Ethical exercises is a rather tempting expression since, as we shall see, the exercises in question contribute in a powerful way to the therapeutics of the passions. Yet here again, this would be too limited a view of things. The word spiritual is quite apt to make us understand that these exercises are the result, not merely of thought, but of the individual's entire psychism. So I like this phrase, spiritual exercise, because it captures all of these concerns that we normally think of as what philosophy is about, or even what scientific and artistic and therapeutic investigation are about, right? So we have this kind of more root definition of philosophy that covers all of these different human activities that we use to transform ourselves, and in transforming ourselves, transforming how we perceive. And so this is the definition that Hadot gives us of spiritual exercise in the most general sense. He says it's a voluntary personal practice intended to cause a transformation of the self. And so this is what askēsis is in its most broad sense. But so what is askēsis? What are some examples? There are lots of different kinds. Hadot talks about contemplative prayer, meditation, fasting, examinations of conscience, dialectics, discursive reasoning, physical training, aesthetics, and visionary experience. And so I want to sort of just throw out all of those different examples because, again, it points back to the fact that there are so many different practices, some of them that are more rooted in the body and somatics, some of them that are more rooted in discussion and dialogue, some of them that are kind of rooted in the sort of intellectual propositional writing that you see in philosophical texts, but they're all equally valid modes of transformation. And the other thing that I want to highlight is that they're all equally capable of yielding insight. So really for Hadot, it's the practices that lead, and the insights come after. So you can have something like a somatic practice, you can have something like a silent meditative practice, You can have some kind of physical activity, sports, athletics. And these things actually create insight. You've had this experience yourself, where you've been doing something else, you've been doing some kind of physical training, all of a sudden a thought, an idea, an insight pops into your head, a little phrase, something like that. And my sense is that it came out of the practice somehow. Somehow the practice generated that. And so the question for me is, how? Like, where did that come from? Like, I can be pretty satisfied with the fact that it works, and I can be pretty satisfied with the fact that if I just keep doing it, I can reliably sort of produce these modes of insight. But I have no idea how they work. And so that's kind of irritating to me. Like, I like to know how things work, and I like to see if I can put them into words. And so this word askēsis seems to be able to do some of that work. So Hadot also, and other scholars, historical uses of the term and so on, will also point to notions of self-discipline, abstinence or austerity. You would hear the word most contemporaneously in the word ascetic or asceticism. It's at the same root as askēsis. But it doesn't just mean this kind of austere kind of celibacy, right? It's got a lot of other definitions and uses. So it's also connected to this figure of the ascete, who's like a monk or a hermit. But this person is also like a skilled worker, like somebody who's really good at like a technique or has a craft. So they practice an art or a trade. So all of these things are examples of ascetic practice in a different mode. So some of the definitions read like to fashion material, to embellish or refine a substance. The theologian and monk Thomas Merton has a nice definition of asceticism that I think is helpful to share. He said, asceticism comes from the Greek askein, to adorn, to prepare by labor, to make someone adept by exercises. It was applied to physical culture, moral culture, and finally religious training. It means, in short, training, spiritual training. So when you look at the history of the use of the word, you find that it's really closely associated with this notion of a development of the senses. And when people say development of the senses, they mean both sort of introspective, contemplative senses, the sense of your own self, paying attention to yourself, but also the physical senses, like your five senses of touch, sight, sound, smell, taste, and so on. It's about developing them in a certain direction to pick up sort of the little nuances and details that, if you're not attuned to those things, would just sort of pass you by, you know. So the sense that I take kind of from all of these definitions is that it does involve this kind of disciplined work. It does involve this kind of exercise or training. It has like a kind of an athletic sort of flavor to it, insofar as like it's something that you'll come back to in a regular way, and you're training up your body, except you're training the senses instead of, you know, training for weightlifting or running or swimming or something like that. So it does have this aspect of like sort of renunciation, but the idea is that like through renunciating you get something back. So you're actually developing things by giving them away. So there's like this strange relationship there between those two in askēsis. And so this idea of adornment, of elaboration, is why I think of perception as it's something like an art form that you're kind of responsible for. Like once this comes online, once you become aware of your participation in these structures and your ability to modify them through practice, you're now kind of a little bit on the hook for how you see the world. But it also is what's going to give you the freedom to configure the world differently. So you can think that there are sort of epistemological valences in the mode of knowledge that these practices might be good for. But if you're a psychologist or a therapist, you'll recognize that this is also the kind of stuff that you'll do in a therapeutic session, where you're kind of letting people know that they're making these emotional and psychological associations between things, and that they actually have some freedom to construct those relationships differently. So you're operating like in the medium of perception, right? And you're something like the craftsperson of perception. So I think of this as a contemplative approach to philosophy, and I want to read this notion of spiritual exercises and contemplation back into transcendental philosophy and phenomenology. I think these resources are there if you're reading them in a certain way, but I think it's also really easy to read something like the Critique of Pure Reason and just get lost in the like sort of heavy discursive reasoning and the just the barrage of new vocabulary terms that's coming at you. But if you could kind of flip what's happening there on its head a little bit, I think you can see it as a kind of a mode of contemplative activity. And I think there are some reasons in the text that justifies this kind of reading. But I'll tell you a little bit about what I think contemplation is first, and then talk about phenomenology and transcendental philosophy. So if you look up the definition of contemplation, it really means 2 or 3 different things, depending on how you define it. One is just a kind of focused attention. So it's not just casually observing things that go by, but it's a kind of sustained effort to attend. It's paying attention on purpose. But it also has this implication that it's not quite just paying attention, it's also like creating a space where something like attention can actually happen, where you're holding a space of some kind, where things can appear, things that you might otherwise miss. So when you're in a meditative mode, things kind of slow down, the resolution on certain things get punched up, you realize maybe there's always been this tension in your body for the whole day, it was just in the background, you give it a space to appear, all of a sudden all these new details kind of become available to you. Why are these things here? So it's a mode of attending, but it's also a space of attention in a weird way. And the third one is that it has this character of involving something like reason or intellect or understanding, but it has to go beyond that. It's not just thinking about things in a really concentrated way, right? It transcends thought. It transcends thought, and if you look at the associations you get in various dictionaries, it's often associated with something like considering the infinite or the divine, or something that defies your rational conceptual categorization. So paying attention, creating a space, and moving beyond reason. And this is actually how Hadot describes Kant's philosophy. He says the entire edifice of critical Kantian philosophy has meaning only from the perspective of wisdom, or rather from that of the sage. So there's some contemplative flavor there. And then Kant himself says, a hidden idea of philosophy has long been present among men, yet either they have not understood it, or else they have considered it merely a contribution to erudition. If you take the ancient Greek philosophers, such as Epicurus, Zeno, or Socrates, we discover that the principal object of their science has been the destination of man and the means to achieve it. They thus remain more faithful to the true idea of the philosopher than has been the case in modern times, when we encounter the philosopher only as an artist of reason. So here Kant is saying that modern philosophy has kind of fallen into this trap of identifying the whole of what philosophy is with reason, and if we're in this contemplative mode, we're going beyond reason. So both Hadot and Kant are saying, what we're doing is about moving beyond this thing called reason. And I think this is really interesting when you think about it in conjunction with contemplative practice, because this is kind of how I think about my own contemplative practice. And so when I read Paul Guyer and Alan Wood, who translated the Critique of Pure Reason, I read something like contemplative meditative practice. And this is how they describe Kant's philosophy. They say this new science, which Kant calls transcendental, does not deal directly with objects of empirical cognition, but investigates the conditions of possibility of our experience of them by examining the mental capacities that are required for us to have any cognition of objects at all. And so they foreground mental capacities here, but I think in Hadot's sense, we're talking about the whole host of capacities that are beyond mental. But so what they're saying is that with Kant, we're moving away from simply studying experience as it appears to us and towards experience as it's constructed by the faculties we bring to bear on it. And so we're trying to get behind experience to its sources, to the way experience is made to appear for us as such. So in other words, Kant was highlighting that the type of experience one is capable of having is related to the structures or capacity of the person having the experience. Kant's philosophy, then, in my sense, is a contemplative approach to the workings of the mind and its structures. And I think this is something that we find throughout the German idealist tradition. And I'll quote our own Matt Siegel on this point, who wrote of the German idealists. The works of the German idealists are better read as a series of meditative exercises to be practiced than they are a series of arguments to be memorized and codified. And I think this is really the right way to read what's happening there. So I think there are some real links here between askēsis and contemplation and transcendental philosophy. But I also see this as a phenomenological project, which is of course connected to Kant's project. But what I mean by that is that what I'm doing is trying to point at some structures, some faculties, some abilities that are operative in all of your own experiences. And so I'm trying to get to a general account of the relationship between askēsis and perception, but one of the features of this count is like the concrete particularity of your own situation, right? So this becomes like a really personal, biographical, embodied kind of really particular thing. And yet I think that when we examine these structures, we can find that there are structures and practices and modes of bringing things to experience, modes of making things appear that we all have in common. We're all, in some sense, capable of doing these things. So there's that kind of personal, concrete valence, but there's also that transcendental aspect in the Kant sense. So I want to get into the weeds here a little bit with Kant. And this part is everything else I feel pretty comfortable with, I'll be honest. I've thought about it, I think it works. The next section, I'm finding a path forward. I'm trying to figure out how this hangs together, but I think it's important to figure out this next piece because there has to be some way that embodied practices can become discursive insights, and discursive insights can become ways of reorganizing the body. So they're open to each other in some way that I'm interested in understanding. And so I'm still thinking with Kant here. And so he says, Kant's philosophy, he says, is this kind of Copernican revolution, right? It's an inversion. It's an inversion of how we, before Kant, had been thinking about the relationship between subjects and the world. And so he says, let's try this. Let's try this experiment. Instead of assuming that our cognition conforms to the objects around us, let's see what happens if we explore what happens if we assume the objects around us conform to the shape of our cognition. And so that's the Copernican shift. It places us kind of at the center of the construction. And so there's like way too much in Kant's philosophy to talk about today. So it's like really just one paragraph that I'm interested in, and it's where he talks about the relationship between sensibility and understanding. And he calls this the two sources of our cognition. And I know some of you are also very interested in this concept of the imagination. And there's two sources, he says, but then later he says, well, actually there's three, kind of. You know, he does these moves a lot where he's like, this is the case. Actually, this isn't the case. There's this other stuff that I left out. So the imagination is an important part of this discussion, but I just don't know how to figure it all in yet. But we can get to it in the discussion maybe. So he says, there's Kant. He says, our cognition arises from two fundamental sources in the mind, the first of which is the reception of representations, the receptivity of impressions. The second, the faculty for cognizing an object by means of these representations, the spontaneity of concepts. Through the former, an object is given to us. Through the latter is thought in relation to that representation as a mere determination of the mind. Intuition and concepts therefore constitute the elements of all our cognition, so that neither concepts without intuition corresponding to them in some way, nor intuition without concepts can yield a cognition. So what I want you to pay attention to here is this, he's got this kind of dual structure of sensibility and understanding. And he says the sensibility, this faculty of sensibility, is receptive. It's taking things in. It's the sense impressions that your body and your senses are taking up from your surrounding environment. And it's in his description, it's kind of dependent on what's happening around you. So all of the things in the surrounding physical world are causing all of these sense impressions, these sensible representations to arise in you. And then the understanding is this other faculty that's involved with concepts and discursive thinking, and it has this quality of not being receptive, but spontaneous. And so he's saying that while sensibility is kind of just taking things in as things happen, the understanding with its capacity for spontaneity is kind of organizing the meaning of these events in a way that's not determined strictly by what's coming into it. And so this, I think, is a really smart move, and I think it gives you like some precise language to talk about why our different sense-making practices and abilities differ, because we all have this capacity for spontaneity. So if there's a way of explaining why we see things differently and why we come to different interpretations, why cultural values change from one social group to another, it's got to do something with this idea of spontaneity. The part that I'm struggling with is where he says that sensibility, the level of sensation, doesn't have this capacity, that it's fixed in a way, it's receptive, and it's kind of agile, but it doesn't have the spontaneous capacity. And so if you dig into the Kant literature, there's actually some debate over whether or not this is the right way to think about it. And so you have people like Henri Bergson who support like a really strong line between understanding and sensibility. And then people like Thomas Land, who I've just been reading recently, who's trying to come up with ways to argue for the fact of spontaneity at the level of intuition. And I can't evaluate enough of the scholarship to tell you whether or not Kant thinks this, but I think that's the right way to think about these things. And I think that there are good reasons for doing it just on the basis of what philosophers of mind and cognitive scientists and so on think today in terms of a whole field of study called perceptual learning, which is suggesting to us that, so one of the examples they give us is expert wine tasters, sommeliers, right? There's a debate about whether or not they actually taste wine differently, or whether or not we all taste it more or less the same, and then some of us have a layer of like knowledge and experience and ability to categorize things that we then sort of retrofit onto the sensation and tell you what it is. The cognitive scientists who work on this say that's actually not correct. You're actually training the body's physiology, so these kinds of experts are actually having a different sensory experience on top of the fact that their knowledge and experience is different. So this tells me that there's something trainable about sensation itself. It's not just at the level of the understanding, and it's not just at the level of concepts, it's at the level of intuitions and bodily sensations. So I think there are reasons for supporting that claim just because there's some interesting empirical evidence that suggests that. But the other reason that I really support it is because it makes sense from this question of how do embodied, non-analytical, non-discursive practices create conceptual and discursive insights. And I think the reason that there's some kind of spontaneity at the level of sensibility is because that level of creative training and relearning and attunement is going all the way down into the body. If it's going all the way down into the body's actually learning and creating different sort of physiological relationships with the world in a way that the original Kantian picture I don't think really captures. And those configurations, those attunements, can then feed up into a way that we can then talk about with each other. And then you can also do the reverse. You can have these sort of conceptual insights or discursive insights, or you can read a great work of poetry or spiritual texts, and you can feel the reverse process. You can feel the sort of the logos, the discourse moving back in the other direction, reorganizing your body, reorganizing your sensation. So I like that kind of softer distinction between sensibility and understanding. It's not a hill I'm ready to die on yet, so if any of you are like really in the weeds with the Kant scholarship, let me know what you think about that. But I think it's something like that, and I think it also does some interesting things to how we think of concepts themselves. And I think that there are good phenomenologists and philosophers of mind who have kind of clued into this idea that there's something intelligent about the body. It's not a new idea, but it's not an idea that's always been, front and center. The body's smart, the body's intelligent, the body learns. But also that there's something not quite detached and smooth and clean about even concepts themselves. Concepts have this kind of elusive, I don't know how I want to describe it. You can't find one. No one's ever seen a concept, right? 3 minutes. So I think Alvanoe has said that what is a concept? It's actually like a skill. It's a skill of perception. It's a skill of the body. And so what you do when you kind of reframe this whole conversation in terms of contemplative practice, askēsis, and perception is that you get this new vocabulary for being able to understand and describe how discursive practices can reorganize your body and how your body can reorganize your discursive practice. So I'm going to stop it there because I want to have some questions and some discussions. As usual, I have too much to talk about. So I'll leave it there.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk, just once, yeah, sure. Something comes online and there's awareness that understanding and sensibility can be worked with, that there's almost a responsibility for that. And so I'm curious about that responsibility to what or to whom beyond the individual, and if there's any kind of overarching structure that sets some normative trajectory for that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. If you don't ask that question and if you don't keep asking that question and kind of live in relation to that question, then I think what you end up with in this conversation is something like a series of life hacks and efficiency improvements and these things that'll get you better at your 9 to 5, this kind of calculative instrumentalizing of the practice. So the practice has to be responsible to something bigger, and the bigger is the moral dimension. I think some conception of the good, it cashes out in different ways, but I think that's another reason why you move into kind of religious and spiritual language, is because you have to have some kind of conception of the good that isn't just, it's not purely relative. You actually have to hold yourself to some kind of standard. And so there's an element of just being honest there, I think. And I think when you're being honest and when you're not, and I think that has some relation to the ethical norm. And so all of the practice, I think, is ideally sort of contextualized in that way.
Great talk, Adam, as always. But this one, I think, really helps give to the PCC project and community a kind of frame of reference for what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Because whether it's philosophy, cosmology, or consciousness, or ecology, these are practices, but the practices go all the way down into the body. They also reach deeply into the very nature of theory and the intellectual understanding, and connect them. And I think your way of presenting Kant is, I think, extremely helpful in kind of getting him out of a Kantian box, in a sense.
Yeah.
And partly of his own making, and to show why somebody like Jung looked at Kant as being just the crucial. He just said, critical philosophy, or the philosophy of knowledge, by which he just meant Kant, which just revolutionized his thinking, is the mother of depth psychology.
Mm-hmm.
No Kant, no critical philosophy. You don't have depth psychology because you don't have that Copernican revolution that allows us to, as Copernicus did, get up above the earth in his imagination enough to be able to see our subjectivity and see how much our subjectivity is constituting the apparent objective world out there, whether it's in astronomy or in the depths of our psychological experience or in our scientific understanding. So I really liked how you brought those all together, and I think so. You kind of theorized it, the PCC project, just really insightfully. The only other thing I'd mention in praise of your continuing to put the pressure on recognizing the spontaneous dimension of sensibility as well as understanding, is that it sounds to me, as you're saying it, that you're really bringing in the degree to which our practice has to do with cultivating and developing organs of perception,
Mm-hmm.
Understood in a multitude of levels. And that kind of connects us to the Goethean project.
Yeah.
Goethe, Steiner, Garfield, a whole, which is very practice-oriented too. But in a sense, when you bring in that kind of archetypal perspective that Goethe is and Jung talk about, you are kind of mediating between the sensory and the concept in a quite vivid way if you open up that organ of perception, develop it, cultivate it.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, the archetypes call us those organs of perception into being, and I think you're giving a very tangible, or what's the word I'm looking for, accessible frame of reference for us to think about these things. Just first rate. Thank you, Dad.
Thank you.
We're very close to the time for the next one.
I just want to ask you, Adam, have you got any good ideas about what spontaneity is? Like that's something that I'm so curious about. Is it something we manifest ourselves? It's something that comes from outside? That's a big working question. I just thought maybe you might have run into something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's something like freedom, indeterminacy, and creativity, or like the irreducible nature of interpretation, or something.
Yeah. The question is it divine inspiration? Does it something come out? I mean, I'm just curious. I'll give this microphone to somebody else.
Probably wrap up.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Good.